As some of you may know, YouTube recently made a slight change to their policy for news channels. If they are government funded, they must state as such under every one of their videos. The rationale behind this move is to make sure viewers are aware of the potential bias of a government-funded source. Two notable channels that have been affected by this policy are Russia Today and Al Jazeera Plus. And, for the most part, this move towards transparency has been met with support. However, some other affected channels have raised a few questions. For example, the US-based broadcasters PBS and NPR are now required to put a disclaimer on their videos. While this disclaimer is slightly different, stating that PBS or NPR is a publicly funded American broadcaster, rather than funded in whole or in part by their associated government, questions were still raised by many as to why this was necessary, or even why YouTube chose that specific message to promote transparency in the first place. A spokesperson for PBS declared the statement vague and misleading, and expressed frustration that they would now have to educate their viewers about something on all of their videos. So, I thought I would take this chance to educate myself and others as to why PBS reacted so negatively, and why YouTube took this step in the first place. The first question is, where does PBS get its money? The US government seems like the obvious answer, yet this assessment is not particularly accurate. In actuality, PBS does not receive any funding directly from the United States government. Instead, back in 1967, US officials created a middleman to handle the distribution of funding for public broadcasting, called the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, or the CPB. This company funds a variety of news stations from PBS to NPR to hundreds of local stations that support low-income and rural areas of the country. In short, the government has no say how much money any one of these individual groups receive. They only decide how much money to provide them as a whole, thus leaving the government's ability to influence the news reporting on any of these individual stations at slim to none. This arrangement begs the second question: whether the CPB itself would be the cause of the bias as a result of being the direct source of PBS's money. However, a mere 4 years after the CPB's creation, the US president at the time, Richard Nixon, vetoed the budget plan for the CPB, claiming that they were influencing their beneficiaries into airing anti-administration content. While these claims were never confirmed, the CPB subsequently agreed to amend their operations by recusing themselves from most of the major decision-making processes about what to air on each of its stations. At present, the CPB is only allowed to review coverage of controversial topics in order to confirm that the representation of the content is fair. Thus, the CPB does not directly influence PBS's broadcasts. The final question that arises is, even if the CPB doesn't have direct control over broadcasters, can they still influence them indirectly due to the money it provides to the recipient stations? In considering this question, it is important to note that the PBS only receives 15% of its funding from the CPB. The remaining 85% comes from public and private donations to the station. This then explains YouTube's word choice of publicly funded American broadcaster. Yet this still raises the question for me, why did YouTube feel the need to point this out in the first place? This brings us back to the concept of transparency. Media is widely considered transparent when 3 conditions are met. 1. When it draws upon a wide variety of sources for information. 2. When a lot is known about what methods it uses in delivering that information. And 3. When information regarding the funding sources for the broadcaster's productions is publicly available. It is the last of these conditions that YouTube is attempting to disclose. Knowing how potential sources of bias, including those resulting from the need to appease a station's financial backers, can influence the reporting of the news is important to audiences, in order for them to fully understand the content they are viewing. Therefore, YouTube's actions in this regard are a step in the right direction. However, further refinement to YouTube's policies will be required before the system they've created fully works. For example, saying something is presented by a publicly funded broadcaster is, as PBS has said, vague if not slightly misleading. When a casual observer looks at that statement, they would not necessarily infer that PBS's funding is made up of a combination of governmental, private, and public donations. Thus, the goal of complete transparency is not met. Additionally, YouTube provides a link below their transparency statement that takes you to PBS's Wikipedia page. While the second paragraph of that page specifically states, all proposed funding is subjected to a set of standards to ensure the program is free of influence from the funding source, it takes a bit of work to find this information. Not to mention that Wikipedia isn't always considered a fully reliable source. Thus, while these details may be somewhat helpful for those interested in actively seeking a deeper understanding of PBS's transparency, it doesn't solve the problem of communicating a clear and accurate message to the casual viewer. Finally, with all of that in mind, remember that the only news stations affected by this new policy are stations that, at least in part, are funded by their associated government, which means that channels like CNN and Fox are not required to provide any information on this topic below their YouTube videos. Thus, I propose YouTube changes their transparency statement and broadens the scope of this policy. In PBS's case, their statement should be something more descriptive for those who don't have the time or interest to dig deeper, like, all proposed funding is subjected to standards that ensure the program is free of influence from its funding source. Because, while Wiki isn't always reliable, in this case the summary is much more accurate and descriptive than YouTube's statement. Additionally, all news channels, no matter the size or the funding source, should be required to provide this information to their viewers, because in the same way that college students have to put together a bibliography, or how we have to put links to our sources below our YouTube videos, everyone should have to inform their viewers where their information comes from, especially if we ever want to stop hearing people shouting fake news.